Welcome back to the Donkey Vote podcast with Francis.
Tobias.
And George. These interviews will be focusing on the past careers of politicians before they entered parliament.
With a strong intention to our audience that anything is achievable no matter what you studied in university or college.
If you like this sort of content, please make sure you like, subscribe, comment, and share with your friends. Also, we are on YouTube and Spotify, so make sure you follow us on those platforms.
Make sure to follow us on Instagram as well to keep updated with the latest episodes and reels that we release.
Enjoy
the interview.
We have the honor to be joined by the member for Wentworth, Allegra Spender. Allegra, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Just for our audience out there who may not know an entire lot about you, could you give us a little brief description of yourself just before we get into the questions?
I'm the member for Wentworth. So if you know where that is, it's basically think Bondi Beach and outwards. I think it's Sydney's eastern suburbs. It's a absolutely beautiful part of the world where I've lived pretty much my whole life, except about 10 years overseas. For me, I've had a really pretty diverse career. I started out studying economics, worked in business, ran a fashion company, worked for the Treasury, worked in Kenya, worked for a hospital, and ran an education charity, and have been the member for the last 2 years almost. And I'm sort of very focused on climate, integrity, inclusion, but also around tax and economic policy as well.
Yeah. And I think we've done a little bit of research about your background there, and that whole tax policy and the economic policy is very, very throughout your whole political career, you really focus a lot more on tax policy as well as integrity and climate change, as you said previously.
Yeah.
I think we might as well get started with the question. So my first question to you, Allegra, is how was your high school and university life, and do you have any memorable moments?
Look, I really enjoyed high school and uni in general, but I think when I think of the memorable moments, sometimes they were the tough ones actually. Like I remember probably a really defining moment was in about year 9, where a group of my friends said basically, sorry, you can't sit with us anymore. We're going to go and sit with some other people. And I still really, that's 25, almost over 25 years ago. I still remember that really vividly. And so it taught me a lot actually at the time about compassion and about what it's like to feel excluded, and about how important it was, that there were some people who were including of me after that. And, I actually made up with those friends. We ended up, a few of them were actually my bridesmaids at my wedding. But I guess that's what I think about school, is that, the moments are very high, but also really low. And some of them are pretty brutal to get through. In terms of uni, like I loved school and loved learning, but didn't really have a strong view on what I wanted to do after school. So I actually ended up starting an arts law degree in Sydney, and then my father moved overseas, so I ended up changing universities and ending up doing an economics degree as well. So that's probably that piece that it's hard to know when you're at school exactly what that path looks like. And, it's being all right with change, I think is pretty important as you try and work out what actually makes sense for you and what is important to you.
Yep. And, as I saw and probably Georgia saw as well throughout the whole of year 12, there were a lot of students as well who didn't really know exactly what they wanted to do.
Yeah,
and even
100%.
now, and even now there's some of our friends from year 12 who aren't really doing anything this year, and they're a bit lost. So I think in general, as you said, Allegra, it's pretty normal not to know exactly what you wanted to do, and before you get into university.
Yeah. Oh, look, I think that's right. And I know, you asked me later, I think, what's my advice? My main is like, you don't have to have the whole thing mapped out because frankly, no one's life turns out as you planned, the good bits or the bad bits, but it's kind of working out, what are kind of the next step and what's of options, like, looking at having a few options and saying, well, and how do you explore things? I'm a big fan of, saying, well, if you're interested in a career, see if you can follow somebody around doing that career just for a day. Because you'll get a bit of a sense. And I did that in my career, actually. I thought I wanted to work in a teaching hospital and as a sort of hospital manager. So I said, look, I found a contact, a friend of a friend, and I said, do you mind if I just spend a day seeing what you do? And that gave me a real sense of what that job would be like. And it made it clearer to me that, yeah, actually, I was interested in that. So I just think, how can you find those different experiences to get a better sense of what's out there for you?
Exactly, because, our interests change all the time, and, something that we may be interested in currently 10 years from now, we might completely hate, and our whole, lifespan is huge. So, we have different interests building up at different times. So I think in general, it's important to, I guess, especially if we've seen now, in terms of university, a lot of people are going back to university later on in life when they're 30s or 40s, just with, different career change. They might have been in their career for 10, 15 years and they might have hated being in an office or something like that. And, they want a different scenery. So I think now it's really important that, we have more opportunities to change careers throughout our life, career, throughout our working life, because, we have different interests and our interests always change.
That's right.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think we'll move.
So yeah.
Go on, Georgia.
Following on for that, after completing your degree, you worked as a business analysis and a policy analysis for McKinsey and Company, as well as the UK Treasury, for about 3 years. So how was this experience overall, and how did it help you develop any economic policies that you hold today?
Look, I really, both of them were great experiences in different ways. I think for working as a business analyst at McKinsey, it was really good to join with a big group of graduates, because it gave you a bit of cohort and people you got to know, and it was a place that they gave you a lot of training, and that was really helpful, kind of particularly early on in my career, and that was a real benefit. And I think probably the biggest thing I took from McKinsey, which I still hold today, is this question of be really clear on the problem you're trying to solve. They used to often say, look, focus, you have this kind of problem definition sheet where you kind of had to say, what's the problem, what's the scope of the solution, who are your stakeholders, all those sorts of pieces. But that big question of what's the problem you're trying to solve? Because often I think, in public policy, for instance, people saying, oh, we should do this. It's like, well, is that actually going to solve the problem we're worried about? Or is that just something that we think sounds like a good idea? And what's the evidence that that's actually going to solve really the problem we worry about? So that's probably the biggest thing I take from McKinsey. And then UK Treasury I was actually in the productivity unit, looking at how do you improve productivity. Now, that was true then when I was back at in the UK Treasury, and it's a really important issue now, which is basically how do we constantly make sure that we use our kind of resources to most effective use. So I think that's been a really sort of seminal kind of experience for me, and that focus on economics and practical economic policy, has really stayed with me.
Oh, thank you for that. Did you want to ask George's question, or?
I was going to actually go back to that question. So when you were working for UK Treasury, was that during the Tony Blair years of the 1990s, or?
Yeah. It was the very early 2000s. So it was just in that early. So Gordon Brown was the treasurer. I worked in the UK Treasury, and Tony Blair was the PM at the time. Yeah,
so that was a very big time in UK history, just because you had the Thatcher major sort of governments for over close to 2 decades. So that sort of change in towards a Labour government must have been pretty different from what was happening previously with Conservative governments, especially around economic policy.
Yeah, I think it was. It certainly was a different time. I joined a couple of years until they were sort of quite well embedded, to be honest. So it was, I think, versus kind of that early days. And again, a lot of my focus was really around working with again, focused on business, which is an area I felt really comfortable in. I'd worked in my family business since I was 8 years old, and I had, worked in McKinsey as well. So that kind of interaction between business and government was something that seemed made a lot of sense to me.
Yeah. I'll actually go on and say George's question. So this does relate a lot to your family business you were just previously talking about. So when you returned to Australia, you began working for your mother's Carla Zampati's business as the managing director for over 8 years. How was it working for a family business overall, and how integral is their role to the Australian economy?
Yeah, look, I said I worked in my family business since I was a kid. My mum was a migrant to Australia back in 1950. She was one of, when she started a business, there were not a lot of women in business. She started her business back in 1965. And she really wanted us as kids to know what it was like to be in business, how difficult it was, how hard you had to work. But also for her, it gave her huge opportunities as someone who didn't have a family background, didn't have family money, didn't have a university education. She left school when she was 14. Her business was actually her way of creating actually like a living for herself, a way to raise her kids, but also allowed her to do something she loved, which is designing clothes, and also running a business. So I mean, I always say with family business, the highs are highs, the lows are low, because when things are going well, that's great, but it's hard because it's personal. And, I worked sometimes with my sister. I've also worked with my brother in that business, and, siblings know how to push each other's buttons. That's true also when you're in family business. and so, so family business is, it's both joyful, but it's pretty intense. I think for me, look, what I take, I've always been, as I said, I grew up in business, and I know how important it is, frankly, to our ability to, pay for the things we care about, for pay for education, pay for hospitals, all those pieces, but also to allow people to express and do and innovate and do exciting things. So I've always been a big fan of the business world, and and it really colours my view in Parliament, because in Parliament, the job is to I think empower communities and people, to create the lives that they want, to support the most vulnerable people, but also to make sure that there are opportunities to build businesses, to build creative endeavors, and it's got to be practical. Because when I think of in business, I wasn't ever thinking about what was going on in Canberra. I was really worrying about the team, my staff. I was worried about the customers. I was worried about the suppliers, and that's all your attention. And so, when you're in government and in Parliament, you can come up with all these laws, but if they're not practical for people on the ground, then it's a real problem. And so that's kind of what I take from that is business is important. We've got to make sure that we create an environment that allows people to build and grow businesses, and business and government needs to be easy to deal with for business, because business, frankly, isn't thinking about government.
Yeah, because as we were saying before, those sort of regulations that the government sets in stone, they have to be practical, because if they're not practical for a business won't be able to work around those regulations and won't be able to see economic growth and to see their customer base increase and that sort of thing if those sort of regulations restrict that. So I think it's important that, as you said, governments make sure that the laws and regulations they put in place are very practical and can help the businesses prosper and succeed into the future.
Yeah, exactly right. And, there are all sorts of important protections that government puts in place to make sure that, businesses don't pollute and do those things. And that's super important and looks after its workforce and stuff like that. But if you don't do those laws in a practical way, then good business people can sometimes do the wrong thing unintentionally. And bad business people, or, people of bad faith, will abuse it in different ways as well. So I think, that practical piece is super important.
Yeah. We'll move on now to our next question for you, Allegra. So, Allegra, you come from a political family with your father and grandfather all being Liberal members and members of Parliament. Did you ever consider running for the Liberal Party? And what sort of advice did your grandfather and father present to you, if they did, before you entered Parliament? And in addition to that, in addition to that, what sort of skills and motivations did you garner from their political career that you try to copy for your own?
Thank you. It's interesting. My grandfather died when I was pretty young. I only knew him till about he was 7 or 8. But he actually wrote a couple of books about his life in politics. And he was a diplomat as well, and very involved in the ANZUS Treaty. So I've actually reread one of his books over the Christmas holidays. And my dad, when I first said, I've been approached to potentially run as an independent in the election, his first advice was, he was I think quite nervous about it, and I think his first instinct was to say don't do it. And I think the main instinct was politics isn't easy, and he lost his seat. He actually lost it to an independent, which was ironic. And so I think he sort of, as a father, he wanted to kind of protect me from it. But by the time we had long chats about it. But at the same time, he sort of felt that the Liberal Party that he stood for wasn't the Liberal Party that was in government now. And, a lot of the values of what, he thought were important were not being represented either. And so by the time I made the decision to run, which was a really hard decision, he was 100% behind me, and he really wanted me to run, but he didn't want to pressure me. So it's funny, it took some time and discussions. And so, I didn't think I'd ever be a politician. I mean, I remember being with Dad when he was in politics, and sometimes going out to things with him. But I didn't think I didn't think I was thick-skinned enough. And I wasn't, and I didn't, when I looked at the major parties, I didn't see a place for me, because I didn't see, firstly, the behavior that I wanted to behave like. I mean, I have to say, the way that so much of politics, is presents, and it's on Question Time, where people are insulting, where they shout, where they're incredibly aggressive. It's not it's not my nature at all, and I really disliked that part. But I also felt like, I felt very strongly about, business and about opportunity and entrepreneurship, which would align me in some ways to the Liberal Party. But then I thought that, they have a hopeless in terms of actually getting women into politics. I don't agree with their climate policies. I don't think they're serious about it. Their refugee policies in some ways have been extremely inhumane. And so there are areas like going, well, I don't fit there for those reasons, but I don't fit in the Labor Party for a bunch of other reasons, and all the Greens. And so I didn't think, I had a home. And so that's why I ended up, running as an independent. And I didn't expect to get into politics. Your second question was what I took from their experiences.
Yeah, around the skills that you might have gained from their previous experience.
Yeah, look, I think I guess I think of both of them. They were people who weren't afraid to make up their own minds. They were, both of them in their own ways. And actually, my grandfather ran as a type of independent before he joined the Liberal Party. They were quite independent thinkers, and I take that, because I think you go in. It's not about going in to sort of, try and be a minister or something. You got to go in there to kind of look after your community and use your experience to date to assess what is going on. And I guess probably the other thing is it's good to come from other experiences before you go into politics, because I think if you're only ever in politics, you can't bring experience as a doctor, or as someone who's worked in business, or as someone who's worked in mining, or someone who's been an engineer, or someone who's run a family business or worked in a charity sector. All those different experiences are useful, and I think both of them had significant careers before they went into politics, and I think that stood them in good stead.
Yep, and you did touch on the fact that your grandfather Percy was, ran as an independent, and he eventually did join the Menzies government after quite a number of years. So I think it's quite interesting there that, as you said, a lot of your family's been very, very strong for that independent voice, which I think sometimes is underrepresented in Parliament. We see a lot of major parties all just towing the line, following, their leader, their prime minister, or the opposition leader at the time. We don't really see as much in the major parties, especially a lot of their politicians going outside, the party line and speaking independently on issues. You see Bridget Archer and Julian Leeser from last year around the Voice to Parliament, speaking against the opposition leader Peter Dutton's view. But you don't really see that as much as we probably used to see back in the 80s and 90s and the 70s. So I think it's really, really important, as you said, politicians keep to that independent voice, because you are representing your community at the end of the day.
I think that's exactly right.
Yeah. We'll move on to our next question. Georgia, do you want to ask this question to Allegra?
Yeah. Sorry. So one of George's questions was, who would you say is your political role model or idol, and why?
I was going to say, I don't really have one, and it's a funny one, because there's no, it's not one that I, say, oh, that person's, amazing or perfect, because frankly, there are parts of many politicians that I admire, and then many parts of politicians I don't admire. So I don't have, one sort of role model. And to be honest, I spend as much of the time being inspired, I think people in the community and people in the business community than I am by politicians. Like yesterday, I met an author called Anna Funder, who is incredible. She wrote Wifedom, which is a great book if you haven't read it. And she talks a lot about and it's really made me think a lot about gender and about the role of women, and about how the continuous of role of empowering women. I met and this week a woman called Jess Hill, who is an incredible domestic violence advocate, has sort of researched, been a journalist in this like the last 5 years, and has very clear and thoughtful views and communicates that. So to be honest, those are probably some of the more people that I kind of get excited by. I've got another book on my desk by a guy called David Lindenmayer, who's an incredible scientist around the environment and around climate and around forestry. And so I get more excited by that than I say, oh, I've got this idol, because there are and people, frankly, in this community. This morning I've been out at a breakfast and around, again, domestic violence. And, the woman who organised it, Sandy, brings so much. She works for a not-for-profit. She brings so much care. She's just, there's so much passion there to support, people in need. And that's, to be honest, more inspiring to me than some political idols.
Yeah, no, that's 100% fair. Like, you're really open-minded. It's like, instead of staying straight into politics, like, you see people from the community, and
Yeah.
no, that's lovely. Another one of the questions that I had was, what made you run in the 2022 federal election for the Teals?
Look, I ran, I got approached, and because I had worked in renewable energy before, and someone had said, oh, look, maybe you should ask Allegra if she might be interested, so I got approached to see whether I would run, and it was the hardest decision I ever made, because I've got a young family. I was running at the time a not-for-profit in education, and I absolutely loved it. I knew it would be really public, and if it's like having a sort of 6-month job interview, with the press following you around, and and it's quite a brutal process. But I ran because I felt that that we weren't standing, that my community, Wentworth, the values of our community weren't being represented well in Parliament. And I just felt I sort of had enough, to be honest. I thought, look, what's the worst that can happen? I can fail. I'll find another job. I'll be all right. And what I wanted to run for was to say, look, I care about the environment, and I think that's really important. And I think that we need to make the right policy decisions in relation to climate and the environment now, because if we don't do them now, we will live with the consequences later. I care about having a kind and inclusive community. That means supporting women. It means supporting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It means to be welcoming, to refugees. It means supporting people when they're at their hardest moments and they're struggling, and making sure that they're sort of not alone there. And at the same time, I want to create an environment where people can build businesses like my mum, that, people can, build the things that they care about, and, have the freedom to make decisions that work for them and their family, and, and build a strong economy. So, and I just felt like those were kind of the values of the community. I just felt we weren't making good long-term decisions for the country, whether it be on climate, whether it be on good government, whether it be on some of the hard issues like housing, where, frankly, we have had decades of absolutely hopeless policies that have left us in a hole. And I just felt I just didn't want to stand by and watch that happen anymore. I felt, well, look, I'll give it a shot. I'll do my best, and if I get in, that would be wonderful. If I don't, I'll survive. But it's too important. These questions and issues that we face are too important to let it go to sort of party politics, which I think in so many ways has failed us over the last period of time.
Thank you.
Yeah, and as you're saying there around party politics, I remember George Washington quoted when he, as the first president of the US, he quoted that he was completely against party politics because it forces people to push towards a certain ideology and a certain party, and they don't want to diversify their views. And I feel like that is pretty true even today. You see a lot of people really sticking towards their certain political parties, and not really diversifying their views a lot, and not being as independent as you said before. So it is a real problem, I think, in society in general.
And look, I think we do need different views out there, and it's important. Like there'll be lots of people in my community who will agree with a bunch of things I say and not some of the things I say. And, that's what society's like. It's that sort of negotiation of, learning from each other, having different views, but finding sort of common ground. But I think if, there's only, you're either with us or against us, that doesn't help. And, you see that in like, I'll take climate policy, for example, the pendulum on climate policy, the sort of, we've got this, now we've got this policy, now we've got this policy. It is not helpful. We actually need a consistent policy that we as a country can get around, but it is the politics that is driving bad climate policy, because people feel they can win elections based on turning climate into effectively a sort of culture war. And I think it doesn't help. And so I think so that's why I think we do need different voices, and we need to think do politics in a different way. And that was what I decided I wanted to be part of.
Good points there, Allegra. So we'll move on now to our final question, just seeing as it's already 11:30 and we're running a little bit behind schedule. So finally, Allegra, what's one piece of advice you'd give to students in 2024, especially those who are starting university or high school?
Look, I think I started out saying try stuff, and I just think, one, be a little bit kind to yourself. You don't know how it's all going to turn out, and you shouldn't have to know. And having sort of really clear and strict plans isn't necessarily going to mean that it works out like that. So my sort of sense is like, it's okay not to know what you want to do. Try and work out what the next step is, and try and get informed about lots of different options. Like, that's the benefit of actually, I think, of being, like at uni or studying, or, at the starting of your working career, you can try things. And if you don't like them, that's okay. You don't have to stick with them forever, but try things, give them a proper go, and think about what you've learned from that experience. And then I think the other side is forgive yourself for your failures. I remember reading a book when I was in my sort of mid-20s, and it was written by this journalist, a UK journalist called John Simpson, and he talked about he's a well-known at that time, in particularly for a foreign correspondent, with a big profile, and he talked in his book about the fact that he got fired from this job, and I was like, oh my God, he's so successful and he got fired from this job. That's incredible. What on earth happened? But it made me actually realize that people who have good careers and achieve really positive things have moments where things don't work out. And I've had moments in my career and in my life where things just haven't worked out how I wanted to, and it can be humiliating. It can make you feel like you're pointless, and you feel like, you're shamed and all those things. But it happens to everybody, and we will all fail, like we all do. And the only thing we can do is pick ourselves up and try and learn from it and keep on going. And so you can't let whatever failures you have sort of stick in your brain and stop you trying things, because you think, oh, I can't do that because I didn't do that, or I can't do that because I'm that not sort of person. I think you just have to, with all of our failures, we need to just kind of embrace them and move on. And I saw my mum was really good at that. She was, in fashion, you have to put out your clothes every year, your sort of collection every 6 months. And she was in business for a long time, and some collections went brilliantly well and some were real duds, and people just didn't buy them. And what she did is she got over it. She kind of tried to understand what had happened, why it didn't work. But she just basically said, okay, that didn't work. Well, next collection, I'm going to try something different. And I think that sort of resilience is really, really important.
Yep, and I think overall that you just really sum it up. I think just having that open mindset basically towards any challenges or any new things you come across in life. Because as you said, when you're young, you're able to experience new things, and it's not as, I guess, important to stick to one thing. Like you can always change and diversify your interest and your job opportunities and that sort of thing, because you still got 40-50 years of working life ahead of you, sadly. So
Yeah.
still got a lot of time to change.
I will say one thing is, like, you do need to apply yourself though. Like, you don't want to kind of like, you say, oh, I can try this and do it for 2 weeks and this for 3 weeks. Like, it's worth like, it's even if you like give it your all, like when you try it, but then don't be afraid to say that's not right. So that's the piece, like, it doesn't but I think that's really fair.
Yeah, don't feel forced, I guess, to, stick out to something just because, you think you can't really change and you can't really diversify. Always, I guess, have that open mindset. But don't, as you said, Allegra, don't continuously change every 2 weeks, because that's probably not a good idea.
No, you've got to find that balance, like all things.
Got to find that balance, exactly. Yeah. And those are all our questions for you, Allegra. So me and Georgia really appreciate you coming on the podcast and talking to us for the last half an hour. we do realize, it's a pretty busy time in Parliament with the budget coming up in a couple of weeks' time. So we do really appreciate you coming on the podcast and talking to us a little bit
My
about
pleasure.
your career before politics and your high school and university life.
Okay, well, thank you so much.